Welcome everybody. My name is Stacey Wordsworth. I am president of the Rural Press Club of Queensland. Welcome to our second online special event. We obviously are still in COVID-19 lockdown and still not back at Tats for lunch, but I guess we're also not sure when we will be. So we're delighted to be able to continue to bring you the latest in agribusiness. But we're doing it remotely, and today we're welcoming around about 350 people from right across the country. One of the great things that's come out of us needing to transition to this digital format has been we have people joining us who just would not be able to make it to a regular event. There are heaps of new names on our guest list today. So welcome to you and welcome to our loyal and valued members who support us month in, month out. It's great to be talking to you. Of course, I have some very special welcomes to make today. First and foremost to our guest speaker, Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment, Senator Simon Birmingham. More on the Minister very shortly. Also today, there is a very familiar face and a friend of the club, a former treasurer of the club on the line, and also a former speaker at our annual Echo Breakfast, Senator Susan McDonald, as well as another great supporter of our events, Queensland member for Gregory, Lachlan Miller. We today have a terrific turnout of working journalists representing News Limited, for example, the Australian, Courier Mail, the Weekly Times, AAP, the Financial Review, Australian Community Media, the ABC, SBS, Rural Media South Australia, and the WA Times. That's the last time I checked registrations. And of course, we're a press club, so we're absolutely delighted to have each of you on the line today as well. At this time, I also want to give a really warm thanks to our sponsors, McCullough Robertson, CBRE and Sunsuper. Now, when these guys signed on to be sponsors again in 2020, webinars were not anything anybody were thinking of, but here we are. And each of our sponsors has continued to throw their full support behind us. And for that, we cannot thank them enough. Quick housekeeping item, there will be an opportunity to ask questions of Minister Birmingham after his address today. I'm pretty confident there's going to be quite a few. So to do this, we need to be a bit orderly about it. We've got a good system in place. If you go to the bottom of your screen, there's a box there that says Q&A. So you click on that, type in your question. You can choose whether your name appears or not. You just tick a box to decide that. And I'll try and get through as many of those as we can with the time that we have with the Minister this afternoon. Look, as you well know, when COVID-19 first struck, public health was the primary concern. And I think we can sincerely say Australia's done a fairly remarkable job of containing this awful virus and keeping us all safe. But of course, this is a global pandemic with global consequences. And what's now proving really uncertain is the impact this will have on trade, something that's absolutely critical to our agriculture industry. When we held our first Rural Press Club online event last month, Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management, David Littleproud, spoke about what this impact could look like, but they were very early days. And as we've seen over recent weeks, days, and I guess even hours today, there is heightened disruption to trade. And without sounding alarmist, there's a heightened level of uncertainty and anxiety around exactly what Australia's role in pushing for an investigation into the global response to COVID-19 will ultimately do to the relationship we share with our largest customer for agricultural exports, China. Already we've seen severe tariffs in place on barley, the cut-off of a number of abattoirs, and speculation is rife. There's more to come. So with that in mind, our invitation to Minister Birmingham could not be more timely. I'll give you a bit of background on the Minister. A South Australian, he grew up on his family's horse property near Adelaide and completed an MBA, I believe, at the University of Adelaide as well. Prior to entering the Senate, he worked for a number of industry bodies across the wine, tourism and hospitality sectors. And after 3 years in the Senate, was appointed to the Shadow Ministry. Since the change of government in 2013, he's held roles including Parliamentary Secretary for the Environment and Minister for Education and Training. And in 2018 was appointed Manager of Government Business in the Senate. Minister Birmingham has held the position of Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment since 2018. And look, at this present time, I think that's a fairly challenging job. So with that, Minister, we warmly welcome you. we're really pleased you could join us for an update today. And look, I'll hand over to you at this point.
Well, thanks so much, Stacey. Thank you for that kind introduction, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for taking the time out to join us here. I'm thrilled to have the chance to speak to the Queensland Rural Press Club. I have visions in my mind that when the Press Club usually gathers, I trust that there is an amazing choice between magnificent Queensland cattle beef or fresh Queensland seafood on the table, and that of course there'd be an abundance of Forex, maybe even Bundy, or perhaps even some wines from the Granite Belt region to celebrate. But unfortunately, COVID means we're meeting by these platforms instead. But I'm really pleased to have the chance to speak with you, and what turns out to be quite a timely opportunity today to speak as well, given some of the commentary over the last couple of weeks. You know, COVID-19 has tested all of us in so many ways, whether it's the way in which we meet or engage, whether it's the health challenges in which Australia stands out amongst the world as a country who has demonstrated how best to tackle those issues, how to ensure the safety and well-being of our population, and even on the economic side, how to ensure the maximum degree of support and resilience that we need. And that support and resilience has been possible because our government entered the COVID-19 crisis with a much stronger balance sheet and budget position and stronger economy than many others around the world, which has allowed us to stand up critical programs like the JobKeeper program and initiative to be able to give support to Australians who need it, to see them through the tough economic times that have been caused by, of course, the restrictions put in place on COVID here in Australia, and of course restrictions elsewhere around the world. Despite COVID-19, though, we can see very strong resilience in parts of especially our export economy through the early stages of this year. And that's so incredibly encouraging that it's the case. I know it was a mixed story for different sectors, as some saw heavy disruption due to the closing down of markets in China or elsewhere, and the disruption, for example, to Lunar New Year celebrations. But despite COVID-19, the latest ABS trade data shows that Australia recorded our 27th consecutive monthly trade surplus in March. That was a record $10.6 billion. And it's pretty incredible to think about the fact that Australia has now stretched out that run over several years of consecutive monthly trade surpluses, reversing a long history of Australia being a country that imported more than we exported. And so many of those from different producer organisations and indeed producers themselves who'd be on the line today have played a huge role in that. And I want to give a big shout out to my Senate colleague, Susan McDonald, who I understand is with us today. And I know Susan as a voice for Queensland agriculture, but also somebody so deeply connected there. You've helped so many in playing a role in driving some of that export growth forward. If we look at indeed what the first few months of this year were like, we see that our beef exports, frozen, chilled and fresh, were up some $455 million, or more than 21% compared with the first 3 months of 2019. That's pretty phenomenal when we think about the disruption that was occurring in the world at the start of this year, and the fact that we were still seeing such phenomenal growth in our exports coming off of what was already a record year last year. And that growth was diverse, and in fact was largely driven by some very strong growth, pleasingly, in the Japanese market, where we saw a $313 million lift, or 65% growth compared with the same period 12 months ago. So that's demonstration that we are actually seeing growth recorded in a range of different markets where we have successfully negotiated trade agreements in recent years, and part of the determination to keep that going. But the disruption to logistics has been real, particularly for fresh premium produce that traditionally leaves the country in the belly of passenger aircraft. That's why we've had to stand up specialised support to be able to keep those goods flowing out of the country. Our government responded by putting $110 million towards the International Freight Adjustment Mechanism. So just as we put in place programs like JobKeeper to ensure Australians kept their jobs at this time, we put in place this freight adjustment mechanism to make sure that those who'd worked so damn hard to secure export markets in recent years didn't lose them just because there was an absence of planes flying to get their goods there. IFAM is helping to keep supply lines open so our farmers can get their premium produce to market. And on the latest check, we've committed support to now more than 733 flights leaving Australia from 7 different departure points, heading into some 28 different international destinations. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of goods exports are being supported in their transit on those flights, equating to over 17,000 tonnes of premium quality pork, beef, lamb, seafood, horticulture and dairy, worth over $700 million on current tallies. And we know that so long as we have these disruptions to global aviation, we're going to have to continue to work hard as to how do we maintain those export routes for our producers and of course how we work with the aviation sector to stand back up normal capacity as quickly as possible. Equally, it's been important to keep supply routes and lines open around the world, and we've worked with a number of like-minded countries in terms of making mutual commitments to one another and encouraging others around the world to do so to keep those supply lines open, whether it's South Korea or Singapore, Canada or New Zealand. And we'll continue to keep working with our like-minded nations to keep trade routes open and to emphasise, crucially, as we have with many others, the importance of, as we exit COVID-19, ensuring the openness of markets around the world and an ongoing commitment to trade liberalisation and market access right across the globe as a crucial part of harnessing an effective economic recovery. Obviously, much of the commentary in the last couple of weeks has focused on some of the issues that relate to China. Some people want to say that we are in a trade war. Some even try to use Cold War rhetoric. We need to keep a perspective around measures that come up at this time. Trade disputes are as old as civilization itself. And although we talk a lot about free trade, in reality, we live in a world of rules-based trade. And now we want those rules as an exporting nation like Australia to work as effectively as they possibly can, to be as consistent as they can, and to be as liberal as they can in allowing trade to flow. We want rules that ensure mid-sized countries and small countries can compete fairly alongside large nations. And that's why we are such a staunch defender of the global rules-based trading system and one who seeks to make sure that in all aspects of our activities, we do firmly pursue a global order that supports and facilitates predictable investment and predictable trade flows. We're also one, though, who is not afraid to use the rules of the system where we think others aren't playing by the rule book. That's why, in terms of World Trade Organization disputes, we've pursued one with our great friends from Canada in relation to the wine industry, with our valued partners from India in relation to the sugar industry, just as our good friends and near neighbours in Indonesia did the same with us on A4 copy paper. That's using the system as it should be used, where each of us has a disagreement about the policy approach of another. We ought to use effective trade remedies and call in the independent international umpire where necessary. We have other disputes or disagreements that may not be at WTO stage, but that continue on in terms of different aspects of trade policy with the US or the EU, or even across the ditch with our friends in New Zealand in relation to Manuka honey. As our largest trading partner, China has been crucial to Australia's standard of living, to the growth of jobs here, but we shouldn't overstate that either. China's been a country with which we've seen strong trade growth, especially in recent years, but so too have we seen with many others. And we should also be mindful that the trade benefits that flow between Australia and China are mutual benefits. The China-Australia Free Trade Agreement has delivered real gains to both of our countries, stimulated economic growth and fueled much of China's industrial capacity in recent years. And in doing so, it has helped to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, not only in China, but across the broader Southeast Asian region. And as those who've heard me speak before would know, when I speak in defence of having open, free markets, I often use that humanitarian aspect of the way in which the economic liberalisation across our region in recent decades has lifted those hundreds of millions out of poverty, created better living standards, longer lives, and better health, education, and other opportunities as the real dividends of free trade and economic liberalisation. And it's why we want to make sure we continue that, because whilst we have gained, so too have others gained. And we all ought to make sure we keep mindful of those mutual benefits that can flow from such engagement. Obviously, we were disappointed with China's ruling when it came to their assessment of our barley industry. We don't agree with it. Our barley producers operate free of any type of distorting government subsidies, and they certainly don't go around the world dumping product on other nations at below cost value. They are, like all Australian farmers, exceptional in their skill, their innovation, and it is that skill and that innovative drive that makes them some of the most productive in the world and able to produce, when the climate conditions allow, large crops of premium grains at high value to the rest of the world. And we'll defend their integrity as strongly as we possibly can. That's why we're considering carefully the next steps that we will take in relation to our barley industry. Again, we ought to be mindful that there are mutual interests at play here. China's brewing industry has valued our malting barley for years. They recognise the quality of the Australian product, and it will be those Chinese businesses and consumers who will pay a price of having to pay more for barley or get substandard product from other countries as a result of this determination. So we hope that there will be reconsideration of it in time. We'll continue to mount strong arguments in defence of the Australian industry, and we'll maintain our right to apply all possible sanctions or opportunities that we can in terms of seeking to resolve it, using the normal pathways through China's domestic systems or the WTO if we need to. I know in Queensland in particular, there would have been much concern and in talking with Susan and others in Queensland around the decisions made about the meat processing plants and the suspension of those 4 licences. These again were highly technical decisions made as a result, allegedly, of failures in terms of compliance with quarantine or customs requirements around labelling or the like. I've said publicly that I think it's extremely disappointing the suspension occurred with no real warning in terms of a notice period, particularly a notice period that would have allowed for us to demonstrate the type of rectification that had been applied by those processes to be able to continue to supply to China, and for China to have confidence that any issues or problems there had been fixed. However, we have what we have in terms of the determination that was made, and our authorities through the Agriculture Department are working really closely with the companies involved and with Chinese authorities to try to resolve these issues as quickly as possible. We've been down this path before when we had a cluster of even more processes suspended a few years ago, and so we understand what's necessary to demonstrate that sound rectification plans are in place, that policies and practices are such that can give everyone confidence that all the rules are being adhered to. And we trust that as that evidence is provided to China and to their authorities, that they will respond swiftly and hopefully reinstate the licences for those processing facilities. Over the course of this last couple of weeks, I've had numerous hookups and engagements across the barley industry, the NFF, growers groups with meat processors and others. And we will continue to have that open dialogue, knowing the best way for us to resolve these issues is to work collaboratively. That this has got to be a response across the arms and agencies of government, my department in trade, David Littleproud's department in agriculture, our posts and our embassies working flat out, but also industry and industry contacts all working together to make sure that we restore this market access where we possibly can. With trade supporting some 1 in 5 Australian jobs, our government remains deeply committed to giving our farmers, our exporters, our businesses the maximum range of choices with whom they do business. We have many valued partners around the world, and we want to continue to work with all of them while we also try to seize new markets and new opportunities. Trade covered by agreements largely negotiated by our government has increased from 26% of Australia's trade in 2013 to around 70% of Australia's trade today. That means that over time we've successfully given more and more exporters preferential rights and access into other markets around the world, giving them a head start on their competitors from other nations. And we're determined to keep doing that wherever we can. Our agreements with Hong Kong and Peru came into force earlier this year. And we're working towards the signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement later this year, which will be an agreement encompassing at least 15 nations, including all of the ASEAN nations, Japan, Korea, China, New Zealand and ourselves. We're also delighted that come the 5th of July, we'll see the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement come into force, giving real opportunities that I'll touch on shortly. And of course, we continue to work hard to secure our agreements with the UK and the EU. Our agricultural exports in 2019 were some 26% more than they were in 2013, notwithstanding the drought conditions that much of Australia had faced, the floods that parts of Queensland had faced, many difficulties that were there. Those exports had grown to be more than $52.5 billion. And I'm firmly committed to make sure that I'm not just an advocate for Australian exports internationally, but that I work hard as an advocate for Australian agriculture domestically, trying to make sure the rest of the country understands just how much our rural sectors contribute. As a government, we facilitate trade for business to undertake. We facilitate it through the types of trade deals that we do. For example, Australian agricultural exporters have benefited from around a 1/3 cut in tariffs under the TPP that occurred earlier this year. The TPP partners benefiting from tariff reductions include our exports to Mexico of beef, which were valued at $13.3 million in 2019, small relative to the totality of the Australian beef industry, but the benefit of TPP evident because that was an around 250% increase relative to 2018. Our exports of fresh grapes to Japan, for example, were valued at more than $50 million in 2019, which again was a 32% increase compared to 2018. So these changes demonstrate that when you get a new agreement like TPP in place that gives that preferential access and changes the market conditions, just how effective our farmers, our exporters, the rural businesses who support them and agribusinesses who support them are at seizing those opportunities and growing those new markets. When it comes to our negotiations with the EU and those that we hope to launch soon with the UK, we are firm in seeking commercially meaningful, improved market access into those destinations. Our goods exports, including our agricultural products, must benefit through the elimination and significant reduction of non-tariff barriers in a commercially meaningful way. We'll be taking the same approach across both of those negotiations recognising our desire to make sure that those huge market opportunities present new opportunities for our farmers and exporters, realising just how constrained we've been because of their policies in recent years and the limited access that we've had. I mentioned the Indonesia agreement before and the fact it will enter into force on the 5th of July, allowing more than 99% of Australian goods exports to Indonesia by value to enter duty-free or under significantly improved preferential arrangements. Some examples of that: 575,000 head of live cattle will be able to enter Indonesia duty-free in year one. 500,000 tonnes of feed grains will be duty-free in year one. The equivalent of some 455 semi-trailer loads of oranges will enter duty-free in year one. 10,000 tonnes of potatoes, 5,000 tonnes of carrots will have their tariff slashed from a current 25% down to 10%. There's also great breakthroughs in terms of market access and in dealing with some of the traditional non-tariff barriers that we face. Indonesia is committed to guaranteeing automatic issuance of import permits for live cattle, frozen beef, sheep meat, feed grains, rolled steel coil, citrus products, carrots and potatoes. This all demonstrates just what a significant breakthrough that agreement is going to be, and we hope to be able to see continued gains in the Indonesian market as year on year under that agreement we secure further liberalisation, further access, and are committed to realising the same types of benefits in the Australia-Indonesia relationship through our mutual growth and the development of their economy and their peoples over time, as we've seen with other trading partners. Determined to make sure that COVID doesn't stop us from helping our exporters to get out to the rest of the world, next week we'll have our first online free trade agreement seminar targeted at Australian exporters and those businesses seeking to export, where they can learn about the current state of play, the importance of operating in a free trade environment, and the financial support and initiatives that are available to help make sure that exporters take successful first cautious steps into exporting. This is a very important step as we've run many of these FTA seminars across the country in recent years, helping provide the advice and the information to grow by many thousands the number of exporting businesses in Australia, and our determination is to help businesses continue to do that even in these very challenging times. I said at the outset though that the importance of a rules-based system was very true to Australia, and it remains so. We want to make sure that Australia's trading interests are protected by an independent umpire able to decide on disagreements related to trade according to universally agreed rules. Yeah, that's not always easy, and there's no point pretending the WTO is a perfect body with perfect rules or perfect processes, but it's a whole lot better than anarchy or chaos in terms of global trading environments. We're disappointed that the WTO appellate body, for example, ceased to function in December of 2019 due to a blockage on new appointments to that body, meaning that it no longer has a quorum to hear new appeals. The consequences potentially of that are that trade disputes between nations could land in limbo indefinitely without that final point of resolution, because the ultimate appeal body no longer can manage to meet. As a result of the impasse, Australia did what we do in so many global fora at so many times over so many years, and that's take a leading role in working with other countries to create a new interim appeals arrangement. This will allow appeals to be heard and to be secured with an enforceability of decisions while this appellate body is not operational. We hope to be able to secure reforms through the WTO that bring the appellate body back to life and back to an operational level. But we weren't going to sit back in the interim and allow that appellate body mechanism to sit void with no replacement. Nor were we going to entertain the idea that there should be 1,000 flowers bloom of different mechanisms to resolve appeals. That's why we're so pleased that 19 WTO members have now taken the initiative that Australia led in terms of establishing this interim arrangement. joining this arrangement, which became active on the 30th of April. We have significant commercial interests at stake in terms of current WTO disputes. As I mentioned before, our Canada dispute, our India dispute, and that reserving of our rights in relation to China. And I'm very pleased that countries like Canada and China have joined as parties to this interim appeal arrangement, demonstrating our shared commitment to having those common rules in place and common, effective, independent umpires settling our disputes. It's not just in that area that we lead the way in terms of global negotiations in the trade policy front. We take a lead role as a nation in developing new trading rules to support economic growth, ever more important as the recovery of COVID-19 looms large, especially, for example, in areas of digital communication, business and trade, e-commerce negotiations, which are crucial and which Australia has been pleased to chair WTO negotiations, which I was pleased to initiate in January of last year. This development of the first set of global digital trade rules will hopefully provide businesses again with a more open and reliable trading environment. A majority of WTO members now, some 84 countries, representing well over 90% of world trade, are now participating in those talks that were initiated by Australia. But just as we look to the future of e-commerce, and we certainly have not forgotten the importance of our historical leadership roles in WTO settings. Those historic leadership roles, especially in terms of agricultural trade reform. Australia is the leader of the Cairns Group in the WTO, a coalition of 19 agricultural exporting nations who have been committed to achieving free and fair trade in agriculture since it came together in 1986. It includes both developed and developing countries, accounting for more than 25% of the world's agricultural exports. Australia and the Cairns Group have long pursued meaningful global reforms to unfair agricultural subsidies that distort trade and have historically unfairly locked Australian farmers out of international markets. We're committed to help create a more level playing field for our farmers and exporters. As an example of this, I was pleased that we were able to launch a framework for negotiations on domestic support in agriculture in January this year to tackle the growing global issue of agricultural subsidy entitlements. Estimates are that these entitlements could globally reach more than $2 trillion by 2030 if they remain unchecked. And they particularly hurt Australian farmers who are efficient despite the sensitivity we have to the effects of climate and drought. Our farmers don't rely on government subsidies to remain competitive nor to turn a profit. Our proposal that we launched for these discussions seeks to cap and to reduce by at least 1/2 the current sum of global trade distorting entitlements by 2030. It's disappointing that the Ministerial Council of the WTO, which was scheduled to meet next month in Kazakhstan, has had to be deferred by a year, but that won't deter Australia's resolve to push on with this concept and to try to build greater global support, as we've successfully done in the past, to create a more open and fair trading environment for our agricultural sectors. Our farmers are amongst the lowest in the world when it comes to any subsidies that are received. It compares and contrasts with those elsewhere. The OECD reported that Australia's support to agricultural producers continues to be amongst the lowest in the OECD. We see, if we look at the contrast, that countries such as Norway, Iceland, or Switzerland in Europe, Japan or Korea in Asia have some of the highest overall subsidies to their agricultural sector. And that whilst ours, such as they existed, have been reformed in line with national competition policy and other pro-competitive reforms, others still have a way to go. That Australian subsidy rates are estimated to be around just 2.2% of farm revenues, compared to an OECD average of 18.5%, with rates of 10% and 9.3% respectively in the United States and Canada, an EU subsidy rate of some 19.7%. This is a demonstration of why it's so important that we continue to drive an agenda of lowering those subsidies, capping, cutting, so that we can create a fairer environment for our exporters into the future. Australia remains determined to do that. We in no way resolve from fighting for reduction in agricultural subsidies. We stand up firmly for all of our farmers who operate free of such trade distorting subsidies and back all of you to be able to continue to access the rest of the world in a free and fair way to sell in a commercial sense your high quality, highly valued product to the world. Look, thank you very much. I know this has been a long address to sit through on a visual presence like this, and so I appreciate the patience of those who've been there. I look forward to engaging in the Q&A now to come. I look forward also to getting back out and seeing you all again as hopefully travel restrictions are lifted and we can resume some business as normal. One of the things I hope to be able to do next year is get along to Beef Australia in Rocky. I know it showcases the beef industry to the world, and what better way to boost our nation's recovery and national spirit than to look forward to being there in May next year. But I hope to see many of you well before then as well. Thanks very much, Stacey, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Minister. And we've had a number of questions flying through as you've been talking this morning. Before we get to those, just wanted to quickly point out that we have an international audience again today, and John Ackerman is joining us from Indonesia. You spoke about Indonesia a lot, Minister, joining us, excuse me, from Indonesia as a board member on the Indonesia-Australia Business Council. So hello, John. But look, jumping right through to questions, we'll start with one from Annabelle Hennessy from WA News, who asks, as Australia seeks to diversify its trade markets, are we likely to move into a position where China is no longer our biggest trade partner?
And we need to be very mindful that China is by far the largest economy in our region, the largest consumer goods market in our region, and of course, the second largest economy in the world. We are not the only country for whom China is our largest trading partner. In fact, most countries across our region have China as their largest trading partner. And that is a function as much as anything else of course, the scale and size of the Chinese market. And that's why it will remain crucially important. Australia and China are forever tied to our shared geographical place in the world. And we have to make sure that though we will have points of disagreement from time to time, though we have different systems of government, different structures and different values, that we do remain open to working in all of those areas of common interest. And it's definitely in our common interest to remain open to one another, including in areas of economic activity and trade. And so that although I hope to see that we can get significant gains in Australian exports into other markets and countries who haven't yet had the same rate of economic growth and growth in prosperity as China had over the last couple of decades. And I hope that their growth in places like Indonesia or Vietnam or India will provide more opportunities for Australian farmers and exporters in the future. It doesn't necessarily come at the expense of our engagement with the Chinese market, which will equally remain crucial.
Minister, Olivia Casely from The Australian has a couple of questions for you this afternoon. She asks, is Australia concerned about the damage the America-China Phase 1 trade deal is going to cause to our agriculture exports, and possibly Phase 2 as well?
Well, we monitor all trade flows closely, and particularly trade flows that come from those types of agreements, which we've been very clear we want to ensure is an agreement that occurs in accordance with established WTO rules and practices. The implementation of it doesn't distort or deny the competitiveness of other countries. We back Australia's farmers and exporters to compete on fair terms against anybody in the world, including our good friends in the United States. And so if Australian beef or Australian grains face higher rates of competition in the China market or elsewhere, Well, that is just competition playing out. And as a country that argues for lower trade barriers and more open markets, we've got to be true to our values and consistent there in recognising that. And so long as that agreement is implemented in a way that is consistent with those WTO rules and simply enables fair competition to occur, well, we're up for it. If we find that aspects of the agreement are implemented in ways that lack that consistency, well, then we'll certainly speak up and engage with the parties appropriately at that stage.
Olivia Caseley also asks if you've spoken to your American counterparts about this development, and shouldn't like-minded, I should say, countries stand together against this sort of coercion?
Well, like-minded countries should always stand together against coercion, and like-minded countries should stand together in defence of common values and interests. And where we are of like mind sometimes differs from country to country, and indeed you can see that in a trade policy sense, as I identified in my remarks before, that our cooperation in establishing the multi-party interim appeal arrangement through the WTO is a cooperation that we've had with the EU, with Canada, with China, and with a number of other countries in response to the issues the WTO has faced. But the US is not a part of that. We're of different mind, I guess, on that particular topic. My US counterpart and I speak from time to time, and indeed we've spoken again recently and reinforced the importance, as I say, of any changes in policy or approach in relation to the US and China being consistent with WTO rules and practices, as we have always urged. But we've also always urged for the US and China to resolve their trade dispute, because that was incredibly damaging to the global economy. And the last thing we would want to see at this point of time, where economic recovery is going to be such a challenge for the rest of the world post-COVID, is for a reignition of trading tensions that somehow harmed global economic recovery and made things worse for Australia and everybody else as well. So our priorities are clear there. We want to see ongoing cooperation from all nations in terms of trade policy, but also commitment to those common rules.
David Foote from Australian Country Choice has a couple of questions as well. He asks, does the Minister, do you feel that a stronger diplomatic relationship with counterparts, or your counterparts in China, would have provided a different outcome to both the barley tariffs and the meat plant suspensions?
China has been at pains to stress that these were long-standing regulatory matters dating back sort of 12 to 18 months in their genesis. And their arguments, at least, are that politics and such matters played no role in the decisions that have been made. Now, I can understand, given the unhelpful comments that China's ambassador to Australia made, why people draw a link between other discussions, such as the debate surrounding COVID-19 investigation at the World Health Assembly, may have played a factor in all of this. I can't tell you what China's motivations are or aren't. I can only report what they tell us, publicly and privately, which is that these are regulatory matters and they are being handled in the usual regulatory way. And as I said in my remarks, we're deeply disappointed on the barley front. We don't think the case has validity, and we reserve all our rights to continue to appeal that and pursue that to get a fairer outcome for our barley producers. And on the beef front, we're seeking to rectify the issues. But the best thing that I can do for our farmers and exporters is not to conflate these issues with other matters, as some may seek to do, but instead to focus on getting a resolution and an outcome by engaging in the proper processes.
So on the barley tariffs, David Foote also asks, is China operating outside of WTO guidelines? And why isn't this tariff, excluding the penalty, protected under the free trade agreement?
So WTO rules and indeed free trade agreements provide for countries to have anti-dumping systems in place. Australia has our own anti-dumping regime that exists, and we have used that on numerous occasions with many countries around the world where we believe that distorting practices have caused product to land in Australia at prices that are below the cost of normal production and therefore of potential damage to Australian industry seeking to compete in a fair and square way. So China has every right as well to run its own anti-dumping system in accordance with the rules of the WTO and in accordance with what's accepted under our FTA, and to be able to establish the same sorts of cases as Australia establishes from time to time on these matters. So our beef or our gripe is not that China has used an anti-dumping mechanism against Australia or uses it with anybody else around the world. Our concern is that in using that anti-dumping mechanism, we don't believe the findings of the case or the way in which the case was heard have given due credence and consideration to the evidence that was presented by Australia, clearly demonstrating that our producers aren't subsidised and don't dump their product in the Chinese market.
Trent Thorne, who's an agribusiness lawyer with McCullough Robertson, one of our sponsors actually, he says that justice delayed is justice denied. It's a well-known legal maxim, and under WTO rules, disputes are required to be settled at a minimum within 12 months from the date of the filing of the dispute. WTO panel reports are now routinely issued long after this time frame, in some cases up to 600 days late, which is, he says, pretty galling when the WTO only deals with approximately 20 cases a year. What, if any, steps is the federal government going to take to resolve this chronic delay problem, particularly given the fact that a number of WA barley growers will not be prepared to wait too long for a resolution?
It's a really good point, and the processes of the WTO are intensely frustrating in terms of the time that it can take to be able to bring a matter and see it completed and resolved through all of the appeal processes. And this is one of the concerns that the US has raised about the operation of the WTO appellate body to date. And although we may not agree with the tactic of not reappointing people to that appellate body, we certainly share concerns about the way in which it has been functioning, the mission creep perhaps that it has had in some ways, and certainly the lack of timeliness in terms of its resolution of disputes. In standing up this new multi-party interim appeal arrangement, Australia has been conscious to try to put a bit of a new broom through that appeal structure to get new faces on board and also to recommit to the timely issuance of findings through that appeal process and to limit the extent to which it relitigates matters that should not need to be relitigated as part of the processes there. And we will continue to push for that type of reform to the WTO processes. And the WTO has to stand essentially on three key pillars. Pillar number one is writing effective rules, rules that we all agree to for how global trade operates. And some of that rulemaking has been slow and tedious in recent years, as we well know, through, of course, the stalling of the Doha round. Number two is around transparency and monitoring, making sure that where countries are applying different measures, they are properly reported, transparent in the way they're reported, and able to be monitored so that the world can have confidence in the way in which those rules are being applied. And then number three is dispute resolution, ensuring that where we think things are running off course, countries can bring a dispute and have it settled. And those things should be settled, yes, according to the evidence, which sometimes takes time to compile and time to hear, and settled in a fair way, but also they should be settled in a timely way, and we share those concerns and have been acting and are acting to try to address them.
Minister, you spoke a lot about subsidies in your address, and Natalie Kotsios, who's from the Weekly Times, has sent in a question which says subsidies, despite many attempts in the past to eliminate farm subsidies, they persist. In response to COVID-19, we're actually seeing more farm support arise in countries around the world. How realistic is it to pursue the removal of subsidies? And in terms of the post-coronavirus trading environment, how big an impact are they likely to have, particularly given the glut we're seeing on products globally, things like potatoes, dairy and wine?
Decades ago, the question could have been asked about how viable it is to pursue the removal of agricultural export subsidies. And Australia worked hard, pushed hard, worked with partners around the world to achieve outcomes that removed those direct export subsidies in terms of farm and agricultural production. Now we pursue the same arguments when it comes to domestic subsidies which we know can clearly distort export prices and the environment in which goods leave countries. We don't pretend that it's easy, and yes, COVID-19 probably is going to make that task even harder as countries look at the disruption to supply chains around the world and turn to support their farming and agricultural sector in vastly different ways. Australia has turned to support ours by trying to make sure that we can continue to guarantee access to market where we can. That's what our freight adjustment mechanism is about. Not giving anybody a free ride. We expect everybody who puts a ton of seafood or a ton of meat or a ton of produce on one of those planes to not only pay what they would have paid pre-COVID, but to pay a premium on top of it. But we're willing to step in and make sure the planes still fly and they fly at least at an affordable rate for producers to get their goods out to the world. In other parts of the world, they're saying that that's not a solution available to them or wouldn't work as a solution to them. And so I know other supports are being applied to farming sectors elsewhere as they are to other parts of an economy. That's why we've been so active through the G20, in bilateral and in other small groupings around the world and the region to get countries to commit that any measures put in place in response to COVID-19 need to be temporary, they need to be targeted, they need to be transparent, because what we want is to be able to return to at least the type of playing field we had beforehand as quickly as possible afterwards, not to find that we have an even more distorted trading environment that our farmers and exporters have to step out into afterwards. So we are well and truly awake to the fact that some may use these current conditions to put in place more protectionist policies, greater subsidies and more distortions to the global market. But Australia will hold the same consistent position we always have against those. We've been active during the crisis in getting countries to commit that these sorts of measures should be temporary, and we will be firmly active after the crisis to remind everybody of the commitments they've already made about not having export subsidies and to drive that agenda in a positive way of trying to cap and reduce domestic subsidies where we can.
There's a question that's come through, which I'm assuming, it says anonymous, but I'm assuming is from somebody within the processing sector, which says, can you provide any reassurance for farmers and developers who are considering constructing abattoirs this year or in the near future about whether they should progress and given we're dealing with this uncertainty and the recent developments, I guess, is that a good idea?
Look, I think everybody investing in agribusiness or farm activity, obviously, like any business undertaking, needs to be mindful of both the risks and rewards of what they're doing and what markets they are targeting. So if you're looking at building a new abattoir or meat processing facility at present, what is its target market? There are not only the issues we've had in relation to the 4 processing facilities who've had their licenses suspended lately, but for an ongoing period of time, we've been concerned that China hasn't approved new processing facilities from Australia. That's not a new issue. It's one that I've made numerous representations on over a period of time. It hasn't prevented our industry from growing beef exports and other meat exports enormously in the last couple of years, but it does mean that that is a risk if you were looking at the China market that somebody making that sort of investment should be mindful of. That said, if you were looking at the Middle East market or you were looking at the Indonesian market or elsewhere, there might be real opportunities to pursue at this point in time. So it is always that question for business to make the decision around risk versus reward. And it's a point that I'm conscious of trying to explain sometimes to media and other outlets, that government doesn't sell wheat or beef or steel or anything else for that matter. We establish through our trade negotiations with other countries of the world the best possible market access terms we can for businesses and exporters and farmers to then walk through the door of those access arrangements and sell where they can. But it's an entirely commercial decision for each of those to determine what market they're doing business with, to what extent they only do business with one market or rely on that market, and whether or not the rewards they think they can get from that outweigh the risks that might come with dealing with a particular market ahead of other markets.
Minister, we'll wrap up short. We were just going to hold on to you for a few more minutes. We've cleared that with your people, just given we're off to a bit of a late start, but not too many more questions. We've got a couple here from Catalina Flores at SBS. She would like to know, have you spoken to your Chinese counterpart yet?
Catalina, no. Unfortunately, the call that we've requested still remains unscheduled. As I've said publicly before, the Australian government is always willing to front up and have discussions, sometimes difficult ones, sometimes over areas of disagreement, regardless of the issue at hand. And we will have those discussions in a thoughtful and considered way with any partner around the world, regardless of how difficult they might be from time to time. And I think the best way for countries to work through any points of disagreement or difference they've got is to engage in that type of dialogue. And that's a message that I would give to any partner around the world, that if they have concerns they want to raise, the best way to do it is to do it face to face, or to pick up the phone, or whatever mechanism is available at the time. But dialogue helps to iron out many differences when you engage in it.
We've had a number of questions come through on news that's broken today in relation to iron ore. So I'll summarise. Those might be easiest. And I guess the sentiment is, how disappointed or concerned are you by the news that inspection rules for iron ore have been introduced?
Well, I wouldn't describe it in that way necessarily at all. We are monitoring, obviously, the news that's come out in relation to iron ore. If these are commitments to streamline the processing of iron ore shipments arriving at ports in China, then on the whole, that's a reform to be welcomed. There have been various commitments made over recent years by President Xi to further open up parts of the Chinese economy and to remove certain administrative or regulatory burdens in relation to exporters. And if that's what this does, then that is a positive step forward. Australia's very committed to, as I said in my remarks, ensuring continued mutual benefits flowing from the China-Australia free trade agreement. And we will look obviously at the details of this and do so in conjunction with the minerals industry in Australia. But early indications in talking to the industry are indeed that this could provide an opportunity for benefits both to China and to Australia in reducing the administration cost of shipments, and could actually help in ways in terms of further stimulating the economic recovery from COVID-19.
One more quick question, and apologies to anybody we didn't get to today. A lot of questions have come through, but there's no name on this question, but it asks, did the coalition of more than 100 nations supporting the independent investigation into the origins of the coronavirus reassure the government that the world has its back?
Stacey, I think we saw common sense prevail in relation to the World Health Assembly decision. Common sense that when you've had a circumstance of hundreds of thousands of people dying across the world and millions losing their jobs and billions of lives being disrupted, of course there should be an investigation into that. And we welcome the fact that it got such broad support, including ultimately support from China in terms of what we trust will now be full cooperation by all parties for the different aspects of inquiry that will ensue. It's important that we learn these lessons. It's also important that Australia plays our role as a middle power nation, engaged thoroughly and actively in global affairs. We are about the 13th largest economy in the world, a seat at the G20 table, and a leader in a range of different discussions. And when it comes to the way in which we engage in trade policy, I've outlined how and where we lead global discussions in so many ways. And when it comes to these sorts of issues, we've got such a proud record of leadership in relation to outcomes on saving lives of Australians and suppressing the spread of COVID-19, that it's little wonder that the rest of the world looks to Australia and engages with Australia on issues related to that.
Okay, Minister, we'll leave the questions there. I know that we've run a little bit over time. Thank you so much for joining us today. I can only imagine how very crammed your diary would be at this point in time. So we do really appreciate you making this window available to us to speak to the agriculture industry. Of course, we're all keenly watching what goes on. Also, keep an eye on your post box. We're going to be sending you one of these. It's customary for us to present our speakers, I can't quite see it, with a Rural Press Club of Queensland tie. We watch the press conferences in Parliament to see if you're wearing this, so we'll be keeping a close eye on that. So keep an eye out. We'll send that off to you. So thank you very much, Minister, for joining us today.
I'll see if David Littleproud and I can coordinate on a day when we're doing a joint press conference to wear the same tie.
He's got two now, so you could potentially borrow one if you need to. But thanks very much, Minister.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. And as always, my department, my office and I try to be as open as we can to industry too. So please keep up the dialogue. Thank
you. Just very quickly before we go, a couple of thank yous, of course, to our major sponsors, CBRE, McCullough Robertson and Sun Super, for their ongoing support. Thank you to Ashley and the team at the SAS Group. Ash has been instrumental into getting our online forum up and running. So Ashley, thank you. You've made this very smooth. I'd also just like to let you know about our next event, which will run on Thursday, the 25th of June. As you will know, early on in the COVID-19 crisis, we saw a large spike in beef sales as consumers stocked up on food that they trusted. We saw those images in supermarket coolers of meats being completely sold out. A lot of the alternatives were still in stock. So I guess the question that now remains is what will bounce back and what will bounce forward look like post-COVID-19 for the Australian beef industry. As I said, join us on the 25th of June for a discussion, a panel discussion on whether consumer interest and purchasing decisions will be influenced by sustainability post-COVID-19, as well as a range of other factors. And we've managed to put together a great panel to discuss this, including Tess Herbert, who's chair of the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework, Darren Robertson, a very well-known chef and owner of, again, the well-known Three Blue Ducks restaurant chain, James Madden, who's Managing Director of Flinders & Co Meat Company, Georgie Somerset, Queensland Beef Producer, Chair of AgForce Queensland, and also Board Director of the ABC. And we are just about to confirm a representative from the processing sector as well. So that email will be going out very shortly. You can register for that. It'll be the same form as we've had today. We'd love to see you on the 25th of June. Thank you again, Minister. Thank you, everybody, for carving out time today. Sorry that we've run over slightly, but we'll see you again next time at the Rural Press Club. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.